Thank you, Thomas, for such a generous introduction. I could spend all afternoon talking about Lumen Christi and how much I believe in it. I really do. I gave a paper maybe 10 years ago at the Catholic Theological Society of America in which I argued that models like Lumen Christi are the future of Catholic higher education, with the just skyrocketing costs of higher education. Lumen Christi and other institutes that are modeled after it are really, I think, the creative ways to move forward and to continue to educate young Catholics who are now not going to Catholic colleges. 90% of students who are Catholic in college are not attending Catholic universities. So it's really a joy to be here. I love Chicago. It's really also a joy to be with so many friends and an old student. I can't believe you're back for more punishment, Will. I mean, that's really amazing. So wonderful to be here. Last night I spoke at the University of Chicago for a Lumen Christi event. I spoke about interpreting Pope Francis, but over the course of the week, of course, it turned into an interpreting the Synod. So I'm happy to entertain questions after I do this short presentation on Evangelii Gaudium. But I decided today I didn't know how much overlap there would be between people who braved to go down to Hyde Park last night and people here in downtown today. So I'll be talking about the Pope's Apostolic Exhortation, but happy to talk more about the Synod in questions and answers. Originally, this Prezi presentation, which by the way I'm very proud of because I am not technological. Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia asked a colleague of mine, Kevin Hughes, and I to present the Apostolic Exhortation to him and his pastoral staff. So this Prezi presentation emerged out of that experience with Archbishop Chaput, and then I've gone back and reread the Apostolic Exhortation for this conversation this afternoon, a year later. And it's been really interesting for me, instructive, and I can see the seeds, the real seeds of the Synod already planted in Evangelii Gaudium, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm sorry that my back's going to be to you guys. Okay, the image of the tree. When I first read this document, it occurred to me that Pope Francis is not a linear thinker, and I still very much think that he's not. The image that the exhortation really comes out of, I think, is a tree. It's deeply rooted in the church, deeply rooted in the global Catholic community. I'll talk more about that. The trunk, the main trunk, is this theology of encounter, which I'm sure you've heard about. The person of Christ, the personal relationship, the encounter with Jesus Christ is that main trunk. And everything, all of the branches emerge out of that. But Pope Francis is not shy about going into the thinnest, outermost branch when he talks about the dangers for pastoral workers to become involved in what he calls spiritual worldliness. Or there's a couple of sections about homiletic presentations for priests, which the truth is the first time around when I read these sections, I thought like, oh, these are for priests. And then I went back the second time around, and they're really excellent, and that I can apply them as a teacher of theology at Villanova. They're really insightful. And the theme, excuse me, I don't know what happened there. The theme of being an evangelizer, to evangelize. In order for us to be able to evangelize as Catholics, we have to be evangelized. And if we're not, if we lose touch with the fact that we have received the love of God and that is what makes us give love to others, then we have to go back to that personal encounter. That's why the tree trunk is so fundamental. This time around, I found a structure, which makes me really happy as a systematic theologian. I hadn't the first time, but there are 5 chapters. So now I can talk about how the branches are related. They're interrelated among each other in a really beautiful way, I think. Chapter 1 opens with that theme of, in order to evangelize, we have to be evangelized. Chapter 2 then talks about the challenges, the contemporary challenges, both internally to the church and externally of the world, that the church faces. Chapter 3 and 4 then talk about how the church needs to respond to the internal challenges. And there, I would think that he would move from general to particular, but instead he moves from the general. He talks about popular piety and personal encounter, and then he moves into that homiletic section, and then he moves back out to catechesis, to broad, sort of more broad, how the laity are involved in catechesis and how important that is. So there's an internal reform, and then chapter 4 talks about how the church responds to these challenges with the world, and sort of the social issues, where he those forceful sections about the poor, about inclusion of the poor in society, the injustice of economic structures. That's where he's most forceful. Is that it? Oh, and then chapter 5, the final chapter, comes back to that personal encounter, reroutes the discussion back in Christ. And the most beautiful thing about chapter 5, that concluding chapter of the Apostolic Exhortation, is that he leaves us with the gift of Mary. Now, as if you're familiar with papal documents, they all end with an appeal to Mary. But most of the time, in my opinion, they can be a little pro forma. We got to end with Mary. We throw in a section on Mary. This Pope has a real dedication to the Blessed Mother, and it comes out so strongly, so clearly in that last section on Mary, and I'm going to talk about that for a second. So now we have an actual, the branches. We can see how the branches are related to each other. The tone. What's interesting about this document is that he has such varied tone in different places. The sections on the homily are folksy and personal sounding. The forceful, where he sounds most himself, the sections on the economic injustice. Definitely you can hear his voice come out so forcefully. He also sounds most himself in chapter 1 and chapter 5, where he's talking about that theology of encounter, the personal encounter with Jesus Christ. He's measured and controlled when trying to soften the tone of how we deal with those on the margins of society with respect to lifestyle and practice. That the tone there sounds measured. It's like the tone is definitely not unified, but he's bringing together different forms of engagement throughout the document. So let's move to the tree trunk, to his theology of encounter. Isn't this cool? You all are probably used to this, but I mean, I'm really not. So, okay. This is Marc Chagall's depiction of the white crucifixion, of the crucifixion of Christ. This is, the Pope has said, his favorite depiction of Christ's crucifixion. I find this deeply interesting. It's not automatically clear why this is his favorite depiction. I am going to just guess a little bit. I do think that Pope Francis is an urban pope. He loves the city of Buenos Aires. He's a modern pope. He's concerned about urban spaces, for example, sacred urban spaces. He's also has this deep friendship with Rabbi Skorka, the head rabbi in Buenos Aires. There's very intense Jewish and Christian imagery in this crucifix, in this painting. It might emerge from that deep friendship that he's had, or from a recognition of the history of anti-Semitism in the city that he loves. I'm not sure. He's also a Jesuit who finds God in unexpected places. So we've got this favorite depiction of the cross. Definitely the cross of Christ is at the center of Evangelii Gaudium. His theology of encounter. If you're not going to read the document at all, you just have to read this one sentence. I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ. That's the message of the Apostolic Exhortation. That's the message of the Synod on the Family, and that's the message of this Pope's pontificate. He also quotes my favorite line from Deus Caritas Est, from Benedict XVI's encyclical. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty ideal, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. This is Pope Francis writing now. Thanks solely to this encounter, a renewed encounter, and he's calling us to that renewal, with God's love, which blossoms into an enriching friendship, We are liberated from our narrowness and self-absorption. I think this is the theme of his pontificate. Roots and foundations. Do you notice that we're at the bottom of the tree trunk? We're at the roots and foundations, which run very deep and very wide in this document. So Pope Francis doesn't just quote from papal encyclicals. He cites Paul VI and Benedict XVI 18 times each. John Paul II he cites 43 times. So he's clearly drawing from recent papal, not just encyclicals, papal documents. So he's drawing from a pontifical tradition, a Gregorian tradition. He draws upon the global church. He draws upon synods of bishops. He had a great experience writing the Aparecida document with the Latin American Episcopal Conference in the 90s. He draws from that document. I think he cites it 8 times. He also draws from the bishops of Oceania, of Africa, of Asia. He draws on Aparecida, Puebla, the Puebla document. He also draws from the bishops in the Philippines, Congo, India, France, the US, and Brazil. He wants the scope to be wide. I think that's another marker of this pontificate, that we are moving away from the Eurocentricity of the church and trying to reach more broadly into, and not to mention more broadly into where currently the church is growing in this in our contemporary context. He also draws broadly from the tradition. He draws from Ambrose, Augustine, Cyril of Alexandria, Aquinas, Irenaeus, Isaac of Stella, John of the Cross, Teresa of Lisieux, John Henry Newman, and that's just the beginning. And from the recent figures like Guardini, de Lubac, and Bernanos. So the roots run broad and they run deep. Okay? The main trunk. Evangelizing with mission and mercy. Just 4 quotes. An evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. It cares for the grain and does not grow impatient with the weeds. This is a key quote. This is a quote that's at the heart of the Synod experience these last 2 weeks. The Eucharist, although it is the fullness of sacramental life, is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. I had a few things to say about that quote last night. I prefer a church. This one I'm sure you've heard because this one the media loves to quote. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. Now, I just want to say a little bit about Pope Francis's cultural context. We in the United States have been enjoying a cultural decay for about 50 years. In Argentina, that cultural decay began much later and hit much more quickly. I'm going to give you 4 quotes that reflects this fact. First, 1987, Argentina was one of the last countries in the world to legalize divorce. Second, 1994, the requirement for the president to be a Roman Catholic was abolished in 1994. Third, now this is where it gets really interesting, 2010. Argentina was the first country in Latin America to legalize same-sex marriage. Fourth, 2012, abortion in the case of rape and medical necessity of the mother were legalized, and that's actually a current live debate right now, so restricted access to abortion in 2012. Bergoglio is either auxiliary bishop or Bishop of Buenos Aires from 1992 to 2013. So he saw that cultural decay. That happened on his watch. It happened in his parishes. It happened most acutely in the Villas Miserias, the shanty towns around Buenos Aires, where he would regularly go and preach and try to get the sacraments to reach these people. When Bergoglio was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, the number of priests serving these shanty towns, and this is poverty like we don't know in the States, quadrupled. Am I getting the math right? I don't know. I think it's from 4 to 26, but it's something like that. Is that wrong? That's probably wrong. Okay, well, I don't recall numbers, so just don't write that down. But it's say maybe from few to many, let's say. Okay. My point here is just that experience is, I think, really shaping this pontificate. So when we read in the press about divorced and remarried Catholics being readmitted to the Eucharistic table who have not received an annulment, he's concerned about these families, these poor families in extreme disarray in these Villas Miserias. He's not concerned about us. We're not at the center at all of that concern. I had some things to say about that last night, but I do think it's important to recognize that the concern is a real one. It's a widespread one in places where the church is growing, and it's a concern that's wrapped up with his wider concern about poverty issues. Reform of church governance. Now, he's got an internal reform section in this Apostolic Exhortation and an external reform section. We already started to see how this is beginning to take shape in this pontificate. He's got the G9, the Council of Advisors, the cleaning things up at the Vatican Bank we've seen, and the changes in the synod process also, with the first step of the synod being this worldwide consultation, this online survey. And out of that online survey, the digesting of that survey produced the Instrumentum Laboris, or the working document for the synod. That's really the largest change in the synod process. There have been other changes too that I think I expect that they're experimental. So the fact that the bishop's interventions last week were not published, they were not made public, but yet the midstream report was. I'm not sure that experiment went as well as Pope Francis had hoped that it would. So we'll see what happens next year. But his impulse to keep the interventions private, I think, was a good one. He wanted to encourage open and frank conversation. That is a good impulse. In practice, I think the Vatican continues to be naive about its relationship to the media. I really do. And this is in part a product of that. And quick and sloppy translations don't help. Okay. I dream of a missionary option, that is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, languages and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation. You can see that is one of the seeds behind the synod process. Absolutely. Everything is to serve a missionary church. In this internal reform, we've already talked about the Curia. He's talked about the conversion of the papacy. He wants to see a more collegial relationship between the episcopacy and the papacy. That is, I think, a work in progress right now. He's talked about, in the document, he talks about the enculturation of the global church. I think we've seen that more within this past year. He talks about laity, talks about the women. The issue of ministerial priesthood is off the table for him, but he does talk about women being invited to positions of decision-making and power in the church. He did, a couple of weeks ago, name a few more women to the International Theological Commission. So we've seen at least one marker in that respect. He also talks about a renewed catechesis in the way of beauty and the art of accompaniment. His aesthetic sense, I think, is very well and beautifully developed. And this term, art of accompaniment, I mentioned last night, arte del acompañamiento, is such a more beautiful phrase. It's so much warmer, and it really gets across what art of accompaniment in English, it just sounds so, I don't know, dry, dusty, not a great term, not a great phrase. I don't think it's a great phrase. So art of companionship I would like more, although art of accompaniment is more of a literal translation. It does get at what he's trying to do, especially in the synod process, right? So one of the big concerns in the synod process is, how is the church going to accompany these families in irregular situations? That comes out of this art of accompaniment, this concern for art of companionship. The church's encounter with modernity or society. External reform. Again, he's the most forceful sections of this document have to do with the poor, the globalization of indifference. He comes from a country that is much more, has seen the marker of class much more strongly. Argentina is still a classist culture in a way that North Americans just can't understand. It's just, I don't know how to say it, but he emerges out of that culture, that clash. Well, not only the clash between the poor and the wealthy, but also historically a very recent drop in or an evaporation of the middle class in his own country. He talks about the globalization of indifference. The culture of prosperity deadens us. Not only to share one's wealth with the poor, not to share one's wealth with the poor, is to steal from them and to take away their livelihood. It is not our own good which we hold, but theirs. He also, in this chapter, talks about ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, where I have to say I don't think he's had much experience other than friendships. He doesn't come across as somebody who's read a lot about a lot of the church documents or other theology, especially on interreligious dialogue. I think he's getting great on-the-job training, and he's done really well these last 18 months. He says a little bit about faith, reason, and science. Again, I don't think this has been central to his concerns. And then a little bit about religious freedom. So these are areas that he knows have to be addressed, but they're not. You don't hear that same voice that you hear in the sections about poverty. And we end with Mary. I've mentioned before that the Marian devotion is real, and it shapes, his devotion to the Blessed Mother shapes this pontificate. At the foot of the cross, at the supreme hour of the new creation, Christ led us to Mary. This interplay of justice and tenderness, of contemplation and concern for others, is what makes the ecclesial community look to Mary as a model of evangelization. And this is my very favorite one. Are you ready? Christ dwelt for 9 months in the tabernacle of Mary's womb. He dwells until the end of ages in the tabernacle of the church's faith. Isn't that a beautiful image to end this apostolic exhortation with? I mean, it's just stunning, and you can't make that up. That comes from a real devotion to Mary. So he in the last chapter, he leads us back to through Mary, of course, all good, solid, sound Marian devotion leads us back to the cross, which is what he does in this last chapter. And I'll finish with one quote, which might be my favorite quote. It's a long one, though, so take a deep breath. Well, I'm the one who has to take the deep breath. Okay. It is impossible to persevere in a fervent evangelization unless we are convinced from personal experience that it is not the same thing to have known Jesus as not to have known him. Not the same thing to walk with him as to walk blindly. Not the same thing to hear his word as not to know it. And not the same thing to contemplate him, to worship him, to find our peace in him as not to. It is not the same thing to try to build the world with his gospel as to try to do so by our own lights. We know well that with Jesus, life becomes richer, and that with him it is easier to find meaning in everything. This is why we evangelize. A true missionary who never ceases to be a disciple knows that Jesus walks with him, speaks to him, breathes with him, works with him. He senses Jesus alive with him in the midst of the missionary enterprise. Unless we see him present at the heart of our missionary commitment, our enthusiasm soon wanes and we are no longer sure what it is that we are handing on. We lack vigor and compassion. A person who is not convinced, enthusiastic, certain and in love will convince nobody. Thank you.